Hey guys, GhazzyTV here with another Path of Exile build guide video. In this one, we're going to be checking out Cripparian's Absolution build, which myself as well as Meixsell has made our own versions out of. And in this one, there's quite a few things we got to go through with the Absolution build. First off, Path of Building is miscalculating the DPS heavily. We estimated on the lower end budgets that the DPS miscalculation is about a third of what it actually is in reality or in the game. However, this actually gets worse when you start to invest into the build, and we spent multiple hours actually trying to estimate the closest DPS that we would actually be doing. And we did this by removing all double damage features and looking at the shock value we got from a crit with against a Sirius with 1 man HP. And this is a pretty nasty calculation to go through. We spent multiple hours calculating it, and the build that I'm currently playing, that I'll show you the gameplay footage on, actually has a peak DPS performance of 370-ish ballpark Shaper DPS, which is pretty fucking crazy if you ask me. Obviously, this is plus minus, I don't know, 50 million to be in the accurate display. And despite that, that is pretty nuts. However, that DPS is displayed with having 3 Sentinels out, and all of those Sentinels would have 1 charge of both Frenzy and Power charges each, and they would also have the Primal Rex Matriarch Spectre debuff on the enemy. This means that if you had 1 Sentinel summon initially on the first hit you do on Sirius, 1 Sentinel is enough to kill Sirius in Awakener 8 or 9 before 1 second has passed and he does another ability, which is pretty crazy actually, which is actually something we have done several times on this build, trying it out in game. On the other hand, there's a few other things that needs to be mentioned, such as the clear damage versus single target damage is quite limited because of the limitation of only having up to 3 Sentinels of Absolution. This means that your clearing ability with this build is extremely limited because of area coverage, is what I usually call it. We are sorting this by removing the Spell Echo support gem and instead using Summon Phantasm as a support for the minions. This allows you to have an army of some extra minions to provide some extra clearing. And due to the build in the higher budget going into Doryani's prototype, we'll also have an army of zombies, golems, and that is also helping you out with some extra damage for clearing. Single target is, as noted, extremely good though. Playstyle is a little bit different with this build, where you have to use the ability similar to Dominating Blow, where the enemies that you're hitting either has to be a rare or unique, giving you a 25% chance to summon a Sentinel, and then, or if it's a blue or magic or a white monster, the enemy has to die within a second of after being hit with Absolution, which is where your zombies and your golem comes into play in the early stage of a mapping where you need to summon your minions. You will simply smack out your Absolution, and if the enemy doesn't die to that, they should die to your zombies when you've casted your Absolution on them, which will then summon your Sentinels. And that's basically it. The last thing I'll talk about before I'm going to show you the skill tree, the gear, the skill gems into this video is basically the fact that I have chosen to remove 2/3 of the DPS that we're doing, which meant that we're only doing 300 plus million Shaper DPS with this version that I'm playing by being more defensive. I chose to go with a block approach, but I would arguably say that spell suppression linked with having or combined together with a ton of chaos resistance would actually give you a better defense, but that would also cost a lot of modifiers on your gear and be in general more expensive, which is a bit hard when you're trying to get the Krangle negative lightning res. The other approach is that you could go with a glass cannon style, basically 2 or 1-shotting any endgame boss, including Feared. However, your build turns into such a glass cannon that I experienced a lot of deaths with this and couldn't really play the build properly, which is why I opted for this more defensive approach, where we're basically 3 or 4-shotting endgame bosses, which is basically pretty fucking fine when you're using a Spell Echo support with them. The other thing I wanted to mention is the build guide that I have is an I've written full-blown version linked in the descriptions below. This build guide includes and focuses on the no Doryani gear whatsoever, full low budget, perfectly fine to league start with, and it's extremely effective. There's a bunch of other PUBs in that build guide, which includes the low budget with the Doryani without any Krangle, Scourge, 3.16 League, and negative lightning resistance gear, which you could get better by running things like Threads of Hope, self-curse yourself with the conductivity through the Wretch Gloves, or simply stacking up Threads of Hopes. There's also 2 other POBs, one for the mirror tier version and one high budget version, which are using Scourge, Krangle, negative lightning resistance gear, which is a cap at minus 200% lightning resistance. Either way, let's just dive into it. So first things first, you are able to level with this build with Absolution as you get access to them. Other than that, it's just a generic approach of using like Frostblink with Freezing Pulse, Frost Bomb over Stormblast Mines, moving over to continuing the Stormblast Mines if you wish to, or just switching over to the Absolution whenever you get access to it. That's generic spell-based leveling for this type of build. It is a witch after all. Normally, I would just rush out and I would pick these nodes up for HP, and I would just pick up the Enduring Bond and the HP into the left-hand side, and I would just continue on the left hand to get the remaining nodes with this, the HP and Righteous Army and Redemption, and then just stick to the endgame tree, basically. If you are switching over to Absolution early on, what you can do is then pick up the Fearsome Force nodes, which is right here, giving you increased AoE for them. Do keep in mind that Absolution is available from level 12, which means that you have very early access of utilizing these nodes, as well as these keeping them alive through these nodes over here. I would, however, recommend using zombies and maybe a Vitality Aura early on to keep them alive better, just to make sure that that works out if you decide to level with them. However, what I want to talk about is the endgame tree, and the best way to do so is to show you this in the low budget version instead of the high budget version. So I'm just going to dive into PUB and show you the low budget version without the Doryani's catalyst. Now, without a Doryani, the tree looks like this. And basically, it's the same tree in the start. Pick up the HP, Lore of the Dead, Enduring Bond, more life, get the defensive nodes early on, and go head down for HP. But if you level with this, I would recommend starting with this part of the tree, picking up the life node here, as well as the sacrifice and spiritual command. Instead of going up here, I would actually take the path through these 2 nodes to pick up the life and go straight into Fearsome Force, and then straight down for Righteous Army and the Redemption, and then connect the nodes here to then respec these 2 nodes to get the life nodes. It would be a generally smoother leveling experience, in my opinion, to do that way. And the Ravenous Horde helps a lot with clearing because of the onslaught as you're clearing minions with a lower budget version. Other than that, the tree is very specific, very generic, and rather specific in what you're going for. You have some of the minion nodes around here, and then it's just HP all over the place, and pick up the Ravenous Horde on your way out to the right-hand side to get yourself Eldritch Battery. The way this works is that once you start reserving all your mana, your Absolution is still doing a hit damage, and by taking this little node here, you actually will be leeching spell damage, and Eldritch Battery is going to make you spend your energy shield instead of mana, allowing you to reserve all of your mana for auras while still being able to spend your mana, or in this case energy shield, for your abilities. And this little leech node will sustain that energy shield for you to cast your spells. Obviously, this means that it's going to be a bit tough to play maps like you cannot leech from enemies. It also can be a bit tough if you're going for higher budget when you have reduced recovery rate of energy shield, for example, due to the leech not sustaining it properly. This is not a big problem, but it should be mentioned as it can be a bit annoying. Other than that, very generic tree. There's one little small detail with this that I didn't see anyone else running, which I will be doing. In the low budget version where you don't use Doryani, you could switch the Plaguebringer node and use Bone Barrier, which I wouldn't recommend because we are going to be scaling armor with this build, and instead you can actually switch this to run with Commander of Darkness for more resistances, but also some extra damage. But I kind of like the Plaguebringer node because the way I like to play my low budget builds is to set them up for the idea of upgrading them into the higher budgets. But it's a matter of personal preference. The Plaguebringer node, I will explain why this is taken and how we're utilizing it, but it's more of an interest for the higher budget, like medium or higher budget versions. Now, without Doryani, you are no longer in need of thinking about your negative lightning rest. Instead, you want to make sure that you cap your elemental resistances, which is why I've actually added, I think I put it on the amulet as per usual, you should cap your elemental resistances with your gear. This has been clearly stated in the modifier here in the amulet. Just get rest on your gear to get your elemental resistances capped. If you can get chaos resistance, that would be preferable. So that basically is the generic approach of the tree. Something you might have noticed is that I am not using Necromantic Aegis, and this is because the Absolution minions are in the current state of the game doing an obnoxious amount of damage, and because of this I decided not to even care about Necromantic Aegis. You can pretty much double your damage output by having Necromantic Aegis with a half-decent shield. Even a Victorious Charity would be absolutely brutal. This is not needed, therefore I instead went with a defensive approach to make my character actually survive, since the damage is more than enough. This means that we're going to use a shield with recovery, life on block, and actually scale block nodes. The other thing to think about is cluster jewels. This is not something we're going to be utilizing in the low budget version. And the last thing is to explain the Plaguebringer. And basically what we're doing is that what Plaguebringer is doing is that as long as you've consumed a corpse recently, you and your minions have increased AoE, which helps clearing quite significantly. But it also means that if the enemy has a nearby corpse to them, you will deal more damage to them, or your minions will do that as well, and the enemy will deal less damage to you. And this is utilized through a very specific thing, and that's when we talk about the gearing. I'm going to start with the gearing and look at the low budget wand, which should be any type of one-handed weapon that either has +1 level of spell skills or level of minion skills with a suffix open so you can benchcraft the trigger. What's really important with a wand or the weapon with a trigger craft is that the first socket should be a green socket, second one should be a blue socket, and third one should be a green socket. Now, if you have a wand, they most likely have a very high probability of rolling blue sockets. This means you'll use the benchcraft in your hideout to put a green socket on it till you have a green and blue, and then use the benchcraft again to make it 2 socket, and then make it 3 sockets. Rinse, repeat that till the third socket turns a green socket. Once you have that, I'll explain that once we get to the skill gems, why that's important. The other gear, like I mentioned, you want to use a Shaper or Crusader-based shield, which is preferably intelligence-based, because you could actually roll a decent spell block mod. But in the low budget, we're just going to put a bench-crafted chance to block spell damage. The shield does want to have some HP, but most importantly, recover life when you block. This is what's going to keep you safe. Helmet on the low budget is a +3 level socket of mini gems to keep the budget down even further. In this PUB, it's only a +2 with a decent amount of HP. I'm using a tabula rasa to display this build in how low budget you can actually do with this character and still do endgame content. Algor Mortis is a very cheap and affordable and easily accessible pair of unique gloves, which generates a case where the enemies is going to take increased lightning damage if you have created a chilling ground or chilling area on them, which is important for us to create, not our minions. So this does not work with skitterbots, for example. So we will have to apply a chilling area for this to work, which I'll show you in the skill gems later. Boots, just generic armor-based, preferably life boots with movement speed. Amulet, just HP. Keep in mind that any piece you can get resistances on, you need to cap them. Rings, just get resistances across the board. You might want to use unset rings. We actually are going to use unset rings in this, but you could tweak around the skill gems a little bit. So instead you want to go for unset rings rather than two stone rings. You want to use a Darkness of Throne belt. This allows you to get a 75% increased efficiency scaling from socketed jewels. But I'm only going to use some cheap jewels with some decent HP with minion damage if you used the minion skill recently. Some other nodes you can get would be flat added lightning damage, flat added physical damage, and also, most importantly, cast speed for your minions. Flask-wise, you want to go for a Rumi's Concoction for extra blocking, some sort of instant life flask, preferably to remove bleeding, and then you want to use a basal flask of armor, any of the tiers that gives you increased armor, because it's going to be nice to get the physical damage mitigation. This is more important on the Doryani's approach. However, do keep in mind that if you're using a basal flask, make sure that you don't use it when you're standing in the middle of a pack of enemies, because it actually will taunt them. So normally you want to try to use this before you move into a pack, if you can avoid doing that. And then a Quicksilver flask, of course, and the remaining jewels is just generic Ghastly Eye jewels. There is a possibility to use like Fortress Covenant and stuff like that, but since we're not using the cluster jewels, we're unable to avoid the negative impact of that, so I try to avoid using them in general. When it comes to the skill gems, however, we're going to start with a trigger as to why we want the green, blue, green color. So the way the trigger works is very simple. The very first socket will be the first spell that is triggered by the trigger craft, which in this case is going to be the top one on a one-handed weapon. Why we need that to be green is because we want to make sure that Desecrate is cast first. Now, the level of Desecrate doesn't matter. Then we want Bone Offering, not Flesh Offering, because we're going for a tankier approach to give ourselves the extra block thanks to Mistress of Sacrifice. This will then allow us to consume every single one of those 5 corpses with our Bone Offering to get the maximum duration effect out of Bone Offering, and then have that rolling. That should be a high-level Bone Offering. The reason we put an Unearth on the last one is only needed if you are using Plaguebringer. What this does is that this will guarantee that you will put a corpse down after you've consumed the corpses, which means that the Unearthed corpse will remain to be there till you consume it with your Desecrate, after your next Desecrate, which uses another bone offering, and then you'll just reapply another unearthed corpse, which means that your enemy should always have a nearby corpse so you deal more damage to it, as well as them doing less damage to you. The 6-link Absolution is very straightforward. It's going to use a Absolution with Spell Echo, Physical to Lightning, Minion Damage, Lightning Penetration, as well as increased Critical Strike damage. And then obviously we change this into a Summon Phantasms for the clearing, which we switch the Spell Echo support gem out with. The next 3-link we're using is an Arcanist brand setup, which is using a low-level Arcanist brand with a low-level Vortex and a proper level Assassin's Mark. This will provide a better curse for us than having the curse on a ring, and it will also generate the chilled area ground, which is which we use in combination with the Albert Mortis unique gloves. And then we have a 4-link setup. In this one, you can have a 3-link 1 socket, but you can also put this in a 4-link. It's a Generosity setup with Wrath and Zealotry, and we're going to throw in Convocation in here. Obviously, you can tweak around and put this elsewhere if you want to, but the Convocation is here just to make sure that we can keep our minions near us when needed or get them out of ground effects. Our next 4-link is a Utility Minion setup. This is what I would most likely put in my helmet, unless I put my Spectres in there. So these Spectres here, these minions, is a Raised Zombie together with Feeding Frenzy, Carrion Golem, and Ruthless support. Now, the reason we use Ruthless, I made a video about this recently, is that because they're every third attack they do, they will actually create a stunning effect, which doesn't really meet the threshold for stunning versus bosses, but it does meet the stunning threshold for magic and white packs of enemies, keeping you a bit safer. If you can tweak around the support gems a little bit if you want to, you can move the golem out of this and put melee splash, which actually allows your zombies to stun entire packs of enemies, which is really nice for defensive layers. The Spectre setup, which is the most likely contender to put in your helmet with the plus level socket gems, is a Spectre gem. This allows you in a helmet to actually move them up to level 25 or higher, which allows you to get an additional Spectre because of the tree. The tree over here gives us a 3rd Spectre, and if the gem level is 25, we actually get 4 Spectres out of this. These are linked with Meat Shield and Animate Guardian, and the 4th link can be whatever you want. For example, you could run a Carrion Golem in this setup and simply have this moved away for the melee splash, like I said before, but you can also skip this to drop one of your unset rings and run it like this. This allows you to have your Carrion Golem buff and ready, and allows you to stun entire packs of enemies if you so wish to. It's just a matter of personal preference. Now, the Spectres we want to use in this build is very specific. We want to use 1 Carnage Chieftain and 1 Host Chieftain. Now, the reason we don't want to use more than that is because when you start a boss fight, they're going to start casting their charges. And then it's going to take a few seconds before they cast them again. So we don't want to waste our time trying to get charges for our Sentinels too much, which is why my POBs are only calculating the Sentinels with having 1 of each charge, which is what we should expect them to have. So normally we have 1 of each, and once we summon a minion, we hopefully get the charges as soon as possible, which should happen within the next 2 or 3 seconds after getting a Sentinel. And the 3rd Spectre would be a Rex Primal Matriarch Spectre. They are the lightning equivalent of Primal Crush Claw. Now, for those of you guys sitting here with looking like a fucking question mark, what they do is a Screech ability. It is an AoE spell that makes enemies take 50% increased lightning damage taken. This is an obnoxiously high amount of damage increase, and it is one of the strongest modifiers in the entire game to scale damage with, and it's absolutely ridiculous. That's why we use them. If you get access to a 4th Spectre, I would recommend running with Arena Master. The reason for this is because the Arena Master's Shield Slam gives everyone around them 40% increased cast and attack speed. Now, obviously, they will cast this as soon as a boss is attackable in a face boss like Cirrus. This doesn't mean that it will apply it to the minions, but rather apply it to you. The reason why this is so good is because that allows you to summon or cast more Absolutions faster on the enemy to have a higher probability or to summon your Sentinel armies faster by you having Absolution being cast faster. We have a generic Animate Guardian in here. Obviously, you should just check the video linked in the descriptions below for the Animate Guardian. There's a whole in-depth guide for how to use it, which kind of gear sets you can use for this. For those of you who have checked that video, the setup we use for Animate Guardian is either if you go with a low-budget setup, which is, there's like 50 different setups you can run. The high-budget version I would recommend is to ignore the curse setup But if you're running without Doryani, then you can do a double curse setup for early weakness or connectivity if you so wish, but run a Kingmaker. Nearby enemies have reduced lightning res, or just go for the Mask and Stitch Demon and go for the Doppelganger, or nearby enemies are blinded. Windscreen boots for the curse with corrupted gloves. But yeah, check the video out. It's Enemy Guardian is a very complex topic and can take 10, 15, 20 minutes to explain. So I'd rather suggest you watch the video if you don't know what it means. The unset rings we're using is actually a Vol Molten Shell. This is something to scale our physical damage mitigation. You can avoid this by speccing into Bone Barrier instead of the Plaguebringer. So that's another option for you, which is why I actually keep these in the build. Determination is rather crucial. It's one of the few ways we scale our physical damage mitigation, which is only 77% in this build. Definitely recommended not to remove this. However, if you do remove the melee splash, that opens up a socket for you if you so wish. But I would recommend keeping both of these for this build and simply getting yourself unset rings personally. You can still open up resistances easier for you by dropping the Plaguebringer and going Commander of Darkness, as long as you're not using Doryani's prototype. I do want to mention a little bit about the higher body version. I'm going to look at the high body version, which is looking a little bit different. And I just mentioned a few quick things here. So for those of you who's just going to go for the PUBs, because I'm not going to go in depth with the higher body versions, there will be PUBs in the build guide, of course. And that is the fact that we're using a Raise and Pillage and a Vicious Bite cluster jewel with life on it. The Raise and Pillage does force us to have some sort of added fire damage somewhere on our jewels to allow us to do Fist's extra fire, but most importantly, increase damage against ignited enemies. Vicious Bite to scale crit. And what we're doing in the higher budget is actually focusing on the defensive scaling. We're using small clusters with a chance to block spell damage, preferably with a high amount of life and chaos resistance, and the second skin notable. This gives us a chance to block spell as well as attack damage and increased armor. We use 2 of these type of jewels, and other than that, it's basically straightforward, because the only other change to this is, of course, Doryani's prototype with a minion helmet. So the 2 things I wanted to mention here is that since we're using Crangled negative lightning resistance gear, we want to use as many uniques as we can. So in this case, we have a minus lightning res Viv Insect, we have a minus lightning res Malachist Artifice with a red socket for one of the auras, and we're also using a helmet, which is the one I wanted to talk about. Now, the helmet for Absolution is very specific. The suffix modifiers is an essence of insanity, giving a socket of gems with 50% physical damage as extra lightning. This is not a conversion. This is straight up, literally just doing you extra damage. There's also going to be a socket of spells having extra crit, as well as a third modifier being hypothermia, which means that we do need to apply some sort of cold damage so we can chill the enemies, unless, of course, you're running with skitter bots, which you can do as well if you so wish for this type of build. However, the prefixes, there are 3 different prefixes you can go with. Concentrated effect, minion damage, and level of socket and minion gems. Turns out that I was expecting the level of socket and minions to be vastly superior. It's not. It's basically on par with the other 3. So if you can find any helmet that has those 3 suffixes, you just need any of the 2 of the 3 available prefixes. Socketed level of minion gems, concentrate effect, minion damage. Any 2 combination, well, if you have all 3, you have the biggest dick around, right? But any 2 combination, and you'll have a high-bodied helmet. Extremely good, very, very, very expensive and annoying as fuck to craft. I have a video about how to craft this, so check out that in the YouTube channel as well. And that pretty much covers the explanation of the build, the skill tree, the gear, the skill gems. Just an overview of everything and some gameplay footage for you guys to check out. But if you want to have the written detailed version, it is linked in the descriptions below. Do check out the written guide for all the details, and all of these PUBs are available in that link as well. So do check them out. Hope you guys enjoy this video, and I hope you guys will enjoy the build if you do decide to play it. Hit me up in the comments below what you guys think of the guide. Hit the like button, subscribe for more content. Until next time, stay safe, keep rocking.